Hello and welcome back. This is the 8th video in the Test First development series, and I'm really excited because today we get to implement our coffee shop library. We actually get to write our production code. Now, as I do this, I'm going to have to write some SQL code and some ADO code, and that'll be interesting. But what I want you to focus on, rather than looking at those implementation details, is how my coding process is influenced by the fact that I have automated tests. It's kind of interesting. You'll see me working back and forth between writing code and running tests, and it might be a little bit different than you're used to. So let's write some code and get this coffee shop going. We've got quite a bit to cover, so I'm going to do a little more copying and pasting of code rather than typing, just to keep things moving. I want to start here in place order, and I want to begin by writing some validation statements. So let me just paste in one of them so you get the idea of what I'm talking about. So here we are saying if string is null or empty, order.drinkName, then throw an exception that drink name is required. So we're just enforcing that rule. And there's a few others. Here's one for the drink length. So if our drink length is greater than 50, throw an exception. The next rule has to do with making sure that we have a valid drink name. So I've put in a little static list of drink names here: latte, mocha, cappuccino, coffee, and tea. So we can grab another validation statement and paste it in. And this one is quite simple. If our valid drink names if it doesn't contain the drink name, then that's not a valid drink. And last, we have a validation for our order quantities. If quantity is less than 1 or greater than 5, throw an exception. So looking back at our test runs, the last time we ran test error conditions, you can see we had multiple failures. In fact, we had 8 of them. Now I'm simply going to rerun that test. Right-click, run. And the test still fails, but we only have 2 exceptions, so we've made progress. So the first thing I want to point out is I did not take the time to step through this code, and I'm not going to. There's no need. First of all, it's quite simple code, but also I know that it's working because when I go and I look at those tests, I understand that I am hitting all of those exceptions because I've written tests that cover them. So this is really one thing that maybe is a change from your normal development process where you write code and then you take some time to step it through. A lot of time, if I feel like my tests are really solid, I really don't bother. I just run the tests and I don't take the time to step through it unless there's an issue. So now we need to actually write our coffee order somewhere, and I've chosen to use a Microsoft SQL Server database for this. I've created a local database, and I created a table in that database called coffee order, which has an ID, a status, a date, a name, and a quantity. So now we need to actually interact with this database. And to do that, the other thing I've done is I've installed the system.data.sql client package, the NuGet package, into my coffee shop library. And this lets me write ADO code. So going back to my coffee shop, we need to add a couple of using clauses up here, using system.data and using system.data.sql client. And one thing that we always need when we're dealing with SQL through ADO is some sort of connection. So I've got a function here that's going to create a database connection for us. So this is a static function called getOpenConnection. I've hard-coded my data source and my catalog in, and I've simply opened and returned that connection. And then the next thing we need is some actual SQL code that's going to do our insert. So to keep this simple, I'm actually going to write my SQL statements right here in C#. Now, I understand this is not the best practice. You want to use stored procedures or an object relational mapper like Entity Framework or something to generate SQL. but it's quick and dirty, and the focus of this video isn't on ADO or SQL, it's on testing. So just take this with a grain of salt. This is just a way to get an example going. So there's a SQL statement, and as you can see, it's going to do an insert. Insert into coffee order, order status, order date, drink name, and quantity, and it's going to set these 4 parameterized values. And then after that statement executes, it's going to select scope identity, which will give us, which will return back the next inserted identity value. And so here is the code that uses the connection using an open connection. It sets our order date to now. It sets our status to pending. It begins a new SQL command using this SQL statement and the open connection. It sets the 4 parameters, our order status, our order date, the drink name, and the quantity, and then it executes this command, returning the result. Now the result from a command comes back as an object. And in this case, it's actually a decimal. So to get our order number, we have to use convert to int32 and convert that object, that boxed decimal, back into an integer. And then we can return it. So that's a lot of code. Let's go ahead and just run it and see if it works. So to do that, I'm going to try testing place order. So let's right click and just try running it. And it works. Our code works. Now there's no surprise. I copied and pasted, so I knew that it worked. But let's say we had made a mistake. So when you write ad hoc SQL like this, something that's really common is to do something like miss a parentheses, like that. So what if we had that kind of typo? What would happen? Let's right click and run it. And what you can see is that now our test is showing us that we have incorrect syntax near semicolon, and we can even see the call stack. It began in our tests with the call to place the order right there. And then we can walk into it and see that it happened, it was raised when we attempted to execute the function. And because it's incorrect syntax near semicolon, I can quickly diagnose what's going on, figure out the problem, put my parentheses back in, and now all I have to do is rerun it and it'll pass. I think. Oh, I put the, okay, there we go. So now we should be able to rerun it and it'll pass. So again, my focus here is not on the ADO code or the SQL code. It's on this work process where little by little, I start dropping code in and just running the tests to see if I can get them to work. So place order appears to be working. Let's move on. We've got a lot to cover. So let's do get order status. Now, one of the things we know is we have a business rule that says we want to make sure that order ID is valid. So I've written a little bit of SQL code. And again, it uses this SQL connection object that we've created, or this function. So we're going to get an open connection, and then I'm going to run a little ad hoc SQL. Select count of star from coffee order, where order ID is this order ID. Set the parameter, and get the count back out. And if count is 0, we can throw an exception. So that should give us one more validation. Let's go ahead and test our error conditions now. Let's just run that. And we are still getting an exception, but we're down to 1. So we cleared one other test right there. So that'll make sure that we have a valid order ID. And then in this particular system, we have this rule that we're going to assume that pending order should be completed. I initially wrote it 1 minute. Well, I'm just going to say 5 seconds because it's not fair to make you sit here for a minute during this video. And then in the coffee shop tests, let's make sure that, yes, the coffee shop tests go for 5100 there. So that's good. So let's just have this assumption that they're going to complete within 5 seconds. So I've got a little code here, which is basically a hack. It's going to say, all right, well, I don't actually have some sort of process that is fulfilling these orders. We're not building that out. So let's just hack it and say, set any order to completed where the order status is currently pending and it has been at least now minus 5 seconds. And then we can say that we're going to parameterize that. And what this will do is it'll just update the database, set the order status to completed artificially, and then we can check our status. Again, that's a bit of a hack. And now the last SQL command is select order status from coffee order, where we have our given order ID. We read this out as a string, and then we parse it back to the enumeration. So now we should be able to check get order status. Let's run that one. And it works. So a fun thing to do as you're doing this is to just sort of start at the top and run all the tests. And what you'll see as we work, some of them fail and some of them pass. And in this case, we also got a pass on wait for order completion because we now have the code that is going to be incrementing their status, or incrementing the order status in place. So we've got one more error and one more function. We've got cancel order. This turns out to be a really easy function to implement because the first thing we can do is just query for the order status using our existing order status function. And if that status is pending, is not pending, it means the status is, or the order is already canceled or already completed, and so you can't cancel it. So that's going to fulfill our last business rule. So let's run our tests now and see if anything else passes. And now our error completions, or error conditions test is passing. So the last thing we need to do is simply cancel this order if it is now cancelable. And again, a little SQL command, update coffee order, set order status to canceled. And now we can run all of our tests, run the entire test suite, see what happens. Hooray, it works. So that's very satisfying. And when you see all your tests pass, it gives you a really good feeling. And the thing I want to emphasize again is, as you'll notice, I didn't do a lot of setting of breakpoints and stepping through. Now, in fairness, I copied and pasted, and so I had already worked out the bugs. But even then, I didn't really need to set breakpoints and step through. The tests were failing. I was able to just look at the code and be like, oh, I've got a problem there. I've made a mistake, and I was able to correct them. So one of the critiques of test-first development is that it takes more time. And I'm going to argue that actually, in this way, it really doesn't take more time. That the time you've spent crafting good tests is more than, well, maybe not more, but it is somewhat recaptured by speed in debugging and getting the initial code correct. You just don't spend as much time fiddling around. You know, right? You get immediate feedback whether you've got a mistake. And it allows you to just write correct code in some ways more quickly. So again, you do have to invest time in writing the tests. I won't argue that that's not real time, but I think you get some back when you start writing code like this. Okay, so now we've actually got our coffee shop library implemented, at least this version of it, and all of our tests are passing. Congratulations. I'll pause there and let you catch up and write some code of your own.